Hi, I'm Mark Pilkington. I'm the author of a revolutionary new book called Retail Therapy. It's about the future of the global retail industry, why it's broken, and most importantly, what can be done to fix it. I'm the keynote speaker at the Smart Stores Expo in September, and I will give you privileged insights into the causes of the global retail crisis and the essential things that you, as a retail industry professional, need to do to survive it. The subject of my talk today is surviving the retail apocalypse. Now, the word apocalypse is a strong word, and many people have said, is it really an apocalypse? Some people say it's a revolution. Some people say it's just evolution and it's normal. I'm going to start by nailing my colours to the mast and saying that I actually believe that the word apocalypse is appropriate. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be any stores in the future or there aren't going to be successful brands. However, when we look at the last 3 or 4 years at facts of what's happening in Western retailing, it doesn't make pretty reading. There have been a very large number of closures, a surprising number of bankruptcies, and a lot of major brands under pressure. Let's have a look at the evidence. Those are the store closures over the last 20 years or so, and you can see there's been 2 peaks. One was in 2008, at the height of the Great Recession, and the other one was 2017. In 2017, nearly 9,000 big brand name stores closed, which is 40% more than in 2008. And in 2008, of course, it was a recession, and you expected a lot of stores to close. But in 2017, it wasn't. And there's also been a very large number of bankruptcies. Over 43 major brands, companies like Sears, once the largest retailer in the world, Kmart, Toys R Us, Gymboree, Claire's, Quicksilver. You can see the names there. These are well-known names. But more importantly, as I said earlier, there's almost no brand that is doing extremely well on a consistent basis. And these are examples of brand names that you'd have said 10 years ago would have been pretty much untouchable. And yet they too have been under pressure. Brands like Victoria's Secret, Polo Ralph Lauren, Abercrombie & Fitch, Guess, Giorgio Armani. And perhaps more shockingly, around a third of American malls are expected to close over the next few years. And let's remember, all of this has been happening in a growth economy. We are in the 9th year of expansion. And yet, this kind of decimation of American retail has been happening. Now, 9 years is historically a very long time for there to be growth. And the question I would leave in your minds is, what's going to happen to American retailing when there's a next big recession? So, that's an overview. It makes depressing reading, and I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus on is what the solutions are. But before we can understand the solutions, we've got to understand the causes. Because there's a lot of comments going around that it's e-commerce or that it's government rates. But in fact, if we look at the causes of this crisis, they are much more fundamental and much more varied than that. And until we can understand those causes, we're not going to be able to find solutions. Before we look at the causes, let's look at what we are perhaps moving away from. Let's look at what I call the classical retailing model and examine how it worked. At the Industrial Revolution, we saw a revolution in the cost of how goods were manufactured. We went from small craft job shops, where everything was made by hand, to large automated factories, where standardized goods could be churned out in their hundreds of thousands at very low cost. And that revolution is responsible for the prosperity that we now enjoy. The corollary to that revolution was that all these masses of goods had to be distributed. You had to find a way to get them from the factory to the consumer. And the answer to that was very simple. It was called shops. Another aspect to it is the existence of brands. While things were produced in small craft shops locally, you knew the reputation of the craftsperson. You didn't need a brand. But as soon as they started being mass-produced in factories far, far away, you needed to have a way of finding out whether they were good or not. And that's why branding came into existence. Brands took the products from the factories, they put their brand name on them, they had large marketing budgets to make sure that everyone knew about these products and had trust in these products. They then took them and they shipped them and sold them to retailers who put them in their stores, for which they paid considerable rents, staffing costs, and other costs related to retailing. Now, as that product went down that chain, at each stage, the different players added a markup. The brand took this product, and in return for stamping their name on it, they more or less multiplied the price by 2 or 3. Then they sold it to the retailer, and in return for putting it in their spaces, the retailer also multiplied on top of that another 2 to 3 times. On average, the markups, the cumulative markups, were 7 to 8 times. So on average, around the world, products in stores cost 7 to 8 times what they actually cost to produce. Now, this is a supply chain. It's also a push supply chain because it's driven by the logic of the factories. You have to produce a large quantity of a standardized product. So you've got to push it to consumers and persuade them to all buy the same thing. Okay? That's the way you achieve the economies. Now, in order to do that, we've got the marketing from the brands, we've also got the marketing from the retailers. And where does the consumer under this old model get their information? They get it from the brands and they get it from the retailers who control the communications channels through advertising, through PR, and through the staff talking to consumers. Your average consumer is paying 7 to 8 times the factory cost, despite the fact that the product physically is the same as when it left the factory. And they did this for 2.5 centuries because they had no choice. Their choice in terms of where they could buy things was limited to a few shops in their district, in their area. And their information, their access to information, was largely from the brands and retailers themselves. So they are on the receiving end of what is essentially a push system, and that system, as I say, stayed in place for 250 years. But it has now been challenged by an alternative system of distribution. And just as the Industrial Revolution was a revolution in manufacturing, this is, in my belief, a revolution in how things are distributed. And it affects both brands and retailers. The first and most obvious thing that changed was that there was now an alternative way of getting goods from factories to consumers, and that was through e-commerce. Now, e-commerce has 5 key advantages, what I call the 5 C's. Cost, convenience, choice, control, and customer service. Okay, let's just run through them. Now, leaving aside the cost of marketing, of customer acquisition, which I know is a major issue, which we'll come back to, the actual physical cost of using a website and a centralized distribution center to move goods from a factory to consumers, the cost of fulfillment itself is 8 to 12% of sales. The cost of running a stores business, it varies, but I've put 30 to 40% of sales. So there's obviously there a big discrepancy. And as I say, leave aside the question of how you recruit customers. That's purely the cost of fulfillment. So stores are quite an expensive way of fulfilling goods to consumers. And secondly, apart from the actual cost of the stores themselves, you've got the cost of the stock. If you've got multiple stores, which is the kind of business I was in, every year I would take my collection and I would copy stamp it 850 times and put it in 850 different locations. And on the first day, people would come in and start buying it, which meant I went out of stock on my best sellers in my best locations. Meanwhile, I was overstocked on my bad sellers in my lower locations. And at the end of the season, I had to job all that off. So the stock system is not a very efficient system. And in fact, in the States, out of stocks cost retailers 15% of potential sales every year. So it's difficult to protect and look after all that stock and keep it in the right places at the right times. That stock duplication effort can be compared with the simple view of an e-commerce business with one distribution center and one stock. So e-commerce businesses are in stock more of the time, and that's a big advantage. Turning to convenience. Depending on the circumstances and your mood, it can certainly be a lot more convenient to buy things whenever you want on your phone with one click and have them delivered to your home than it is to go to a store. Now, there's all different types of stores and there's all different types of experiences, right? You've got grocery at one end and you've got going out and getting a nice dress or something pleasurable at the other end, okay? And I understand that those are different sorts of experiences, but overall, it can definitely be more convenient to buy over the internet. Thirdly, we have choice. The fact is that what you can fit on a website, because it's just electronic, is much greater for any given level of cost than what you can fit in a four-walled store. For example, Best Buy is one of the largest electronics retailers in the world, and they have huge stores. And they sell in their televisions department 80 options of television. And when you see it, it's very impressive. It's huge, huge ranks of televisions all laid out. And it looks good. But if you go to Amazon and put televisions in, there's over 500,000 options. So in terms of choice, what can be offered online dwarfs what can be offered in a physical store. Fourthly, control. Now, I'm a retailer, and I would always say, yeah, my stores are great. You know, if someone asked me, I'd say, well, we do a great job. But I know that in my own business, a lot of the time, I didn't really know what was happening in these 850 locations. Okay? I couldn't possibly control what was happening in these 850 locations simultaneously. I was employing a lot of minimum wage staff, and I was expecting them to deliver fantastic customer service on all times. Despite the fact that their work was backbreaking, I was expecting, for example, all my stores are in stock, but as we've already seen, they weren't. And product information in stores was lacking. Now, you compare that with the best internet companies. They lay out the product information very clearly. They have great search engines. The service is not as good as the best retail experience with a live human, intelligent, sentient being, but it's standardized. You always get the same service every single time. So it's not variable, and they tend to be in stock more of the time. So control is a big thing that they have that retailing struggles with. And lastly, what I call customer relationships. Having all the information in one place, on one database, has given the e-commerce companies a huge advantage in terms of data analytics. They've collected all the information about their customers. They know what they buy, when they buy, how often they buy. They're able to analyze it. They're able to apply sophisticated algorithms to it. They have a lot of technology people who are innovating in this area, and they're able to personalize the service and run very, very good customer relationship management programs. All of those things, although we try and do them in retail, it is harder. For a start, the stuff is often in different places. We may have a store database. Is that the same as the internet customer database? So these are just a quick summary of what I see as the advantages of e-commerce. And armed with these advantages, the e-commerce players have chipped away at retail for the last 20 years. If you look at the growth rate of global retail, the whole world, it's been average 4% over the last 4 years, whereas e-commerce has grown by 72%. And though the overall global market share is only 10%, as we say, it's varying by country. In the US, it's estimated at around 13%. In the UK, it's nearly reached 20% last year. And in China, it's reached already 25%. But wherever you look, it's growing very, very fast. So we can expect these percentages to grow. Now, e-commerce has come in two types of formats. One we're very aware of, which is what we call the large online marketplace, right? The Amazons, the Alibabas. These companies are missing out the retail stage and offering a very, very large number of brands at a somewhat reduced price. There is another model that you need to be aware of if you're not already, which is called the direct-to-consumer model, which has emerged more recently, really in the period 2010 to 2014. And this, if we go back to our supply chain, not only misses out the retail stage, it also misses out what we call the traditional brand stage. These are companies, very, very lean companies, working directly with manufacturers and bringing the product directly to people under their own new brands. And they have been able to offer products of a quality that is radically beyond the prices they're charging for them. So these guys are really revolutionizing the supply chain, missing out two stages. And the way they do their marketing has been different. We'll look at that later on. But they're not using the big sales forces, and they're not using the big conventional marketing budgets of the traditional brands. So these are the two models. And that's how e-commerce is impacting things. But the revolution that we're seeing goes well beyond just e-commerce. And this is a very, very important point. It's also an informational revolution. The new technology has not just delivered a new way of fulfilling goods, it's also delivered a new way of communicating. And this, if anything, is even greater in its potential impact. And it's interesting that since this developed, which developed later than e-commerce, it's accelerated e-commerce's growth enormously. The two are working in tandem. This information revolution, which we see around us in social media, in peer-to-peer reviews, in the growth of online bloggers and influencers, and in price comparison sites, has upended the retail and brand control of information, which remember earlier on we saw they had a total grip on that information. Nowadays, the consumer's in a very different position from before. Not only do they have the choice, not of a few stores in their area, but of almost a limitless choice of online stores, they also have access to almost perfect information. Woe betide the brand or the retailer that has a problem with their product. In the old days, if you had a problem with the product, you might tell your family and friends. Well, nowadays, you can tell 7 million people that there's a problem with this product if it goes viral. So it's a very risky situation for suppliers. And conversely, if you have a great product, that can go viral too. So the grip that the brands had over people's minds has been undermined, and there's an alternative way of getting very large numbers of consumers to find out about your product over the social media. And that is not through conventional advertising, it's through peer-to-peer spreading of information. And if you've got a product or a service that is revolutionary enough, it will go without you paying for it. All you do is you get it to your enthusiasts, fire them up, and they do it for you. This is a revolution in information. And then the last cause of the retail apocalypse is what I call retail complacency. Now, I say that because, as I say, 20 years ago, everyone thought that the internet was going to destroy retailing, and then it didn't. And I think in the aftermath of the dot-com bust, a lot of retailers breathed a sigh of relief and said, okay, we'll keep on going. We'll build internet businesses alongside our stores business, and we'll trade through both. And they didn't understand, perhaps, how powerful the new channel was going to be, and therefore they did not really focus enough resources or get the right kind of people to be able to build significant size internet businesses. And even though they had businesses and they were growing at 20 or 30% per annum, and they put that in their annual reports, it was 20 or 30% of nothing. And they didn't move their cultures. The fast-moving dot-com companies were technologists. I spoke with a senior marketing person for Facebook, and he told me that all the Facebook marketing people are engineers. They are all able to program their own promotions and marketing campaigns. So when you're working for Facebook, you can't say, I want to run a campaign, I'll give it to the IT department. There is no IT department. Everyone is IT, and they're expected to do it themselves. Now, that makes them much more fast-moving. Retail's been very centralized, it's been very top-down, give it to the IT department, and it's been very slow-moving. And as a result of all of that, this is the situation by 2017, which is that these huge retailers like JCPenney and Sears and Macy's and Walmart, who controlled the landscape in the 1990s, have permitted Amazon to obtain over 40% of this fastest growing channel. And the top 7 retailers between them only have 11%. So, in summary, I see retailers being like the Titanic. It can look very impressive, but my view is that it's holed beneath the waterline. And water is seeping in. And just as the Titanic didn't look as if it was going to sink about 3 or 4 hours after it hit the iceberg, but nevertheless, the water was coming in. And the problem for retailing is that, like the Titanic, it's a rather top-heavy structure. It's got a lot of fixed costs. And therefore, there's not really a retailer in the world who can afford to lose more than 10 or 20% of their sales before they start to get into considerable trouble. It's all top slice in retailing. It's that top slice that pays for everything. And we've seen what happens as retailers start to go down, because they've got so many legacy assets on their balance sheets. They've got the stores. As they close the stores, it decimates their balance sheets. As they lay people off with all of the pension liabilities, it can decimate their valuations. The damage to their brands after they go bankrupt, there's a lot of evidence that when brands go bankrupt, now everyone sees the news, the sales plummet in the quarters that follow. We've seen that with House of Fraser, we've seen that with Mothercare, and therefore the brand damage of going into decline is very, very considerable. Okay, what are the rules for survival? The first rule is go with the flow. Now, this is the big picture thing. It's not detailed. If we believe that e-commerce is a more efficient way of getting goods from factories to consumers, because of the reasons we've talked about earlier on, the choice, the cost, the control, convenience, etc., etc. If it's got these big advantages in fulfillment, and if the technology trends are going to further enhance those advantages, then, to me, that is the flow of history. and we need to go with the flow of history. We mustn't be closed-minded about it. We have to look at it in a clear-eyed way and say, what exactly do our stores bring to our picture? Am I my stores, or am I my customers? And if there's a better way of getting things to my customers, because at the moment they're mine, shouldn't I be looking at those things? So, if e-tailing and direct fulfillment is a more efficient way of getting goods from factories to consumers, then should you be putting all the goods through your stores? Okay? Should you be taking these products down this long line from the factory to the brand to the retail warehouse to another prettier warehouse called a store, and then finally to the consumer? Because it's a very long route. There's a lot of stock tied up in that route at any given time. And as the stock's tied up in it, you've got a lot of risk as well. So, what I'm suggesting is this. If some smart e-commerce company is going to come along and take your customer anyway, using the 5 advantages I've described, wouldn't it be better if you persuaded your customers to buy on your cheaper, lower cost internet distribution platform? People are going to come into your stores and they're going to look at your products and they're going to try them on and they're going to try them, and then they're going to go on their phones and they're going to find somewhere cheaper to buy them online. That's called showrooming. So my question is, if they're going to do that, isn't it better that you do that? Now that means separating in your mind the cost of doing it through the store and the cost of doing it through your internet channel. And if you understand that the cost of doing it through your internet channel is actually lower, it may not look lower, but it actually is. Once you've moved them onto your website, you then have the potential ability to enjoy all the advantages that the e-commerce players have had in terms of low cost of remarketing, in terms of data analytics, understanding your customers better and being able to remarket to them. Now, one of the reasons that retailers have struggled to build good online businesses is because of the high cost of customer acquisition. It's high anyway. It's high for the e-commerce companies, and they're really good at it. It's been shockingly high for the retailers, which is why all the retailers didn't build or haven't built big online businesses. It's discouraging. It's so expensive to recruit customers. Now, here's a much cheaper way of recruiting customers to an online business. You've got the customers coming into your store every day. You've got them there. All you have to do is put an internet terminal in your store, sell it to them in the normal way, but when they come to actually want to buy it, you say to them, okay, you can either buy it at this price, and I'll give it to you now, or if you sign up to my website, I'll deliver it to you today or early tomorrow for free at 10% less. Okay? Now you have to play with that because you don't know at what point they're going to migrate. But I can assure you that whatever it is, it's going to be a heck of a lot less than it would cost you to recruit someone online to an online business from scratch using online marketing. This is potentially extremely low cost recruitment medium. Now at the moment in America, you've got these big retail groups. They've got 30, 40, 50 million customers going in their doors every week. They've got all these people there, but they're seeping away. And my argument is, grab them while you've still got them. Grab them and move them into your ecosystem rather than let them go into somebody else's ecosystem. Now, if you can get more of your customers to accept that route, it has a number of implications. Your store does not primarily have to be a place where you hold stock. One of the reasons that stores have to be the size they are is because they're actually full of a lot of stock. And I think of the big American big box department stores, which have just got room after room after room full of things like TVs and mattresses, and that's what's taking up all the space. The bit where they actually deal with the customer is very, very small. And if you start to take the stock out and you do more of your stock fulfillment directly, you can potentially shrink your store footprint. Okay, now this is important. You may not want to shrink your store footprint because you may like your store the way it is, but it's going to be essential that you reduce your costs, because if you don't reduce your costs, you're not going to be competitive. If you keep the stores the way they are, you're not going to be competitive with the online players. Those stores are big fixed assets and they cost a lot of money, and they're costing more all the time with the rates and all those other things. And the point is, you have to use them every single time to remarket to your customers. Take the strain off the store and put a load of your customers online where the cost of marketing is much lower. You can have a different sort of store. Now, it's not just about shrinking it, okay? It's about what you can do with the space. But the point is that you should see stores as brand recruitment points, not as the main way that you fulfill products. Because using stores to fulfill products, as we've seen, is a very expensive way of moving products from factories to consumers. What do you do with the space that you liberate? You can use part of it to create brand theatre. Remember, you're a brand, okay? You've got to do something with your brand in your store that you couldn't do online or that somebody else couldn't do online. Now, what can be done in stores that can't be done online yet is to create this kind of 3D experience. So that's where the investment in having a great brand experience. Invest in the seating areas, make the customer interaction area bigger, make it more comfortable, offer free coffee and maybe a free beer, depending on what business you're in, or free glass of wine. Those are very, very important because they can't do that online. And above all, as you take the strain off the stock fulfillment element, the staff role changes. In the States, over 50% of staff time is spent on stock processing. Okay. That's what makes the work so backbreaking. Also, you need a lot of people to do all that work, so it ends up being a minimum wage job because you can't afford to pay people lots and lots of money. Now, if you take that function away, they can focus on customers. You can even have different sort of person. You probably don't need as many people, but you can pay them more money and have better people. Because again, that's something the internet can't do. We've said at the very beginning that nothing matches a brilliant person in a store who really knows a lot about the business. But as it's a minimum wage thing at the moment, they move on and all the training you give them is wasted. If you could pay them better, have fewer of them, and focus them on customer service, get rid of all the basic functions, and focus on making that experience a Rolls-Royce experience for the customers. Now, the other thing you can do is use your stores to create what we call third spaces. Now, the idea of the third space is a concept that was developed a few years ago, which is between the home and the work is the third space. And the classic example of a third space is Starbucks. It's a place where you go to hang out, okay? Now, your brands have a certain meaning. Your brand has a meaning for your customers. Something brings your customers in. What is that magic sauce? What is it that you share? You probably have a passion for what you do, right? Some of your customers share that passion, right? How can you make that more? How can you turn this into a community? There's some really great examples of this. There's a cycling company called Rafa Cycling. And they've turned their stores into what they call clubhouses. And in return for a small annual fee, you not only get benefits like special trips and special equipment and lower costs of equipment, etc., etc. You also get to hang out in the clubhouse and have free food and free coffee. So what do all the cyclists do? They hang out in Rafa. And as they hang out as a community with staff members who are also passionate about cycling, a fantastic thing happens. Because what better place to incubate new ideas, to find out what customers think about different products than that? It becomes a friendly community experience. Lululemon with the yoga classes. Lululemon sells athletic products mainly to women. But what do they really sell? Lululemon was one of the first sports brands for women, okay? Because sports brands 20 years ago, it was all very masculine, right? And they came along and they said, no, we're going to do this thing with women. And they do a lot of activities with the women. And Lululemon is not really about sports clothing. That's the least of it. It's about empowerment. It's about self-fulfillment. And they celebrate that by doing these activities in their stores. I do not believe for 1 minute that the future lies with all of us sitting in our rooms on our phones. We're social animals. We like to go out and do things. The more you can make your store into a community clubhouse for your brand community, where you share with your enthusiastic customers your enthusiasm and passion for the brand, the better it's going to be. Now, we've talked about technology, and I put this low down the list because everyone is probably pushing technology at you, you know. I think the technology is important, but you have to understand why you're using it, and you've got to get the big picture. I mean, there are 3 areas where it can help. Automating basic functions. There's no point in having your staff spend their time processing tills. You hand that to the consumer through an automated processing of the payment. You can invest in the experience through things like interactive digital displays. Those are very useful because the customer can come in and it may recognize them and it knows what they like and it feeds them what they like, or they pick up a product and it'll show them that product on someone who looks like them, all those kind of good things. It can also be just very impressive just from a branding point of view. And you can use it also to understand your customer journey better. So who's walking past your stores, who's coming in, have they bought there before, can you pull up their past purchases for your staff to see so that they know what kind of things they like, where do they get switched on by things, where do they leave, like mapping of stores. So those are the 3 areas you can use technology. Marketing. Okay, we've talked about marketing moving from push to pull. This is very important. The traditional means of marketing through magazines and TV and all those kind of things is dying. and more of the marketing is taking place over social media. But the problem with social media is that what do people do on social media? They want to see their friends. They do not want to see adverts. And when brands try and move their traditional advertising on social media, it doesn't work. There's lots and lots of evidence that brands are wasting money on that. What works on social media is a story, is a real story. Like this guy, he created a real story, you know? He created this revolution, and we've probably all got them in our pockets now because of that revolution. You've got to become the conversation. You can't just buy people's attention anymore. You have to earn it. And that means you have to do something different. You can't just throw money at the problem of marketing anymore. This goes back to what I talked about the supply chain. You've got to ruthlessly eliminate stages and costs from your supply chain. If you are a retailer selling brands, that is a very long supply chain. That's going to give you the markups we've talked about, the 7 to 8 markups. That is not competitive in the long term. Okay? Someone is going to find a way, a smart direct-to-consumer brand is going to find a way to move that same product, or even a better product, to the consumer from the factory at a lower price. That's a fact. Okay? And although we've talked a lot about customer service and all those good things, at a certain level, if the price is different enough, people are going to move. Okay? So you've got to ruthlessly squeeze costs out of your supply chain. And when I say your supply chain, I mean your whole supply chain, not just the bit you look after. Okay? If you're a retailer, you've got to start to move towards private label because you're paying a heck of a lot of money for that brand name on it. Remember, by putting that brand name on it, it becomes 3 times the price. You don't have to do that. You can just get it from the factory. Secondly, all the things we've talked about. You've got to try and shrink your store costs. You've got to use your costs only for those bits that only they can do. And not for anything else, because the more you leave in there, the more it's going to cost you, okay? The more it's going to make you uncompetitive. Okay, so use the store for what it can exclusively do, and what it can exclusively do mainly really, really well is to recruit customers and get them into your online business where you can service them on a repeat basis more cheaply. Okay, that's the magic element the store adds. Now, if the cost of your store is higher, the cost per customer is higher than what you recruit people online, you should dump the store completely, which I don't believe. I believe the store is still potentially a lower cost medium for recruiting customers. But that's the way you should gauge it. If it's costing you $100 to get a customer by online marketing, and per customer this store is costing you $200, then the store's not competitive. You might as well just go online and do it online. Do you see what I mean? Okay? Don't be too in love with your store. It's just a means to an end. The point is, squeeze the costs out of the system. You have to do it. Because believe me, other people will be. And if you can't match them, they're going to win. We've talked a bit about this, so I'm not going to repeat it all, but the key thing now is you have to see your brand in a different way. It's not a push system anymore. You don't define the brand anymore. You need to see yourself as a curator of a community. It's interactive. Bring them into it. Ask them about products. Get their ideas. Get them to test the products. And above all, get them to market the products. Get your team to market the products. And let them co-create it. They'll love it. That's how you get people these days. And linked to that is the idea of the higher purpose. And this is for employees and it's for customers. Just selling stuff doesn't work anymore. The really successful new brands are putting helping the world, giving back to the world at the center of what they do, whether it's helping the environment, whether it's helping people's health, whether it's just helping people generally and being extremely charitable. And I don't mean just some odd activity that's tacked onto the business to make the company look good. It isn't about that. It has to have some fundamental purpose. And many of these companies, these direct-to-consumer companies, like Warby Parker, for example, they sell eyeglasses. And for every pair of eyeglasses they sell, they give one to people in poor countries. Everlane, which is a fashion company, direct-to-consumer company, they've made their thing about the factories. They look after the people in the factories. They go and build schools and hospitals for their workers. You know, that's what it's about. And that also motivates the staff. It's very, very important. And lastly, take the hack away. Now, what do I mean by the hack away? It sounds funny. The hack away is the opposite of the centralized retailing culture. It's a decentralized system whereby young engineers are encouraged to go off and develop new things on their own. And because it's so measurable and you can test things so easily, It enables them to do it. Now, this may not be appropriate to smaller businesses, but it's very important in the bigger retail businesses, they shift their culture. One retailer that's shifting its culture is Walmart. They hired a guy called Mark Law by buying his company, Jet.com, for $3 billion about 3 years ago. They've put Mark Law in charge of all their internet assets, and he's introducing this hacker culture into Walmart. And as a result, their results are going through the roof. He's brought in a lot of technology people, and they're really investing in that technology. And that's an example of a huge retailer doing that. But culturally speaking, it's really, really important to move away from the very centralized approach. So, let me just summarize it. There is a crisis in Western retailing. I think we can't hide from it. Hiding from it has not worked for the last 20 years. We have to face it. It's going to spread around the world. It's got multiple and complex causes. It's not just about e-commerce, remember. It's about the whole supply chain. And I believe that these changes taken together represent the biggest revolution in the way things are produced and distributed since the Industrial Revolution. And as that was a revolution in manufacturing, this is a revolution in distribution. And it's going to have an effect every bit as much. It is probable in a few years' time that people will be buying things at a much lower markup on factory costs, yes? They're not going to be buying things at 7 or 8 times the factory cost. They're going to be buying them 2, maybe 3, whatever, a much lower amount. I don't know where it's going to end up. And therefore, you have to take that into account and get ready for it. In order to survive, the changes needed are fundamental and radical, and they seem like I'm knocking down the church, if you know what I mean. And I'm a retailer like most of you, okay? So I understand how it feels, but I can't see any other way. These are the rules, just to summarize them. If you take these rules and you apply them from now, as quickly as you can, in the ways that are appropriate to your business, I know every business is different, that they will help guide you into the future and hopefully ensure that you have a prosperous business in the long term.